One of the challenges we face as business owners is what to do about energy. How are we going to put solar on our buildings? Are we going to have to put charging stations in? Is the electric boom done? Is the electric car boom over? Are we going to just see fossil fuel cars now? What are we going to do, and how do we prepare for that? We have tax incentives for renewable energy that are expiring. We have certainly we have continuing incentives for fossil fuels. And pretty much, I think it's a very confusing place. So how are we going to navigate all this as business owners, as people who have, we have employees coming to work? How do we navigate that? What do we do? So welcome to the Wealth Ability Show. Today, we're going to discuss exactly what we can do and what to expect in the future. And we have an expert with us. I'm very pleased to welcome Kenny Stein. Kenny, thanks so much for joining us on the Wealth Ability Show.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
And if you would, Kenny, give us a little of your background. You've got a pretty impressive background when it comes to energy.
Sure. So I'm the Vice President for Policy at the Institute for Energy Research. We're a free market-oriented think tank that obviously focuses on energy policy. We're based in Washington, D.C. I've been with IER for about 8 years now, I think. And then prior to that, I worked on the Hill. I worked on a couple presidential campaigns. So kind of politics and policy and energy, like where those things intersect, that's me.
That's awesome. And so let's start with a kind of a big picture here. President Trump has said, we want to drill, baby, drill. Of course, there's a downside to that from the producer standpoint, is that oil can get too low. And we saw it get too low a few years ago. So what do you think is going to happen with regards to oil, and just from the production standpoint? Are we really going to be selling all this oil to Europe like they promised that they're going to buy? Are we going to open up leases in Alaska? What are we going to do from from an energy policy in the US, do you think, over the next few years?
Sure. Yeah. So there's definitely a tension there between some of the things that President Trump says. He wants to increase oil production, but he also wants to lower oil prices. So those two things don't go together. So, but honestly, there's not that much that the president himself really can do to make a big difference. That, global oil prices, like the United States production has a huge impact. We are the largest single producer, but we are still small in the grand scheme of things. We don't drive prices ultimately. So global price fluctuations are what ends up affecting our production in the United States. And if prices are higher, maybe due to lots of wars in the Middle East, for instance, we're going to produce more. But if prices fall, there's going to be less investment and less drilling in the United States. That's just the way it's going to happen. Now, some of the things that the Trump administration is trying to do, at least will make the playing field a little easier for increased production. That's trying to improve the leasing process in Alaska. The Biden administration did a lot of work to shut down really any attempt at production in Alaska. They did a lot of work to shut down offshore oil development and further drilling. And they also had some environmental rules that made even drilling on state and private lands more expensive and more difficult. So a lot of that is being either quickly eliminated, or some of it you have to go through the regulatory process to withdraw those things. But so the atmosphere for oil and natural gas development is getting better in the United States, just the regulatory atmosphere. But especially when it comes to oil, we're still at the mercy of kind of global price fluctuations. Now, natural gas is a different situation. When you talk about Europe, I'm not sure how much of our oil Europe is going to buy, but they're already buying our LNG exports, and they want more. So that's a growing market, and that's driving further investment in natural gas production in the United States. And really kind of our limit right now in the US is our export capacity, not necessarily our production capacity.
Oh, interesting. So, okay, so we're making it easier, oil and gas. On the other hand, the one big beautiful bill made it harder, ostensibly, to do renewable energy, since those, particularly the solar and the wind, are phasing out. Now, they phase out over really several years from now, but they do phase out. How do you think that will impact, or will it impact, the adoption of solar and wind energy as part of our grid?
So yeah, the reconciliation bill, it does end the subsidies that both wind and solar have had for quite a long time now. And I think the impacts are going to be very different for wind versus solar. The problem with wind for electricity generation is that it's very expensive. And there's very few places where it makes economic sense absent some sort of subsidy or a government mandate requiring you to have, renewable energy installed. Solar is a little different because solar in some places, you mentioned you're in Arizona, in places like Arizona, solar makes a lot of sense. Like it can help meet your air conditioning production use peak in the hottest part of the afternoon. Southern California, Texas, Florida. Now, Massachusetts, where they have a ton of solar panels, that doesn't really make much sense there. But so I think there's going to be a lot more separation in the industry between solar and wind. I mean, you've already kind of seen that, frankly, in the last few years, as solar panel costs and battery costs have partly due to Chinese subsidy, but they've continued to fall in the last few years. Whereas the inputs for wind development have not fallen, and frankly, they've gotten more expensive. And things like offshore wind are wildly expensive to do and don't really make sense absent subsidy. So there's going to be a separation there. Solar is going to continue to grow, frankly, because again, like I said, in some places it makes a lot of sense, and also the fact that it can be built quickly means that it's not the ideal generation product for a lot of people, but if you can get it fast, that's better than getting it slow. There's so yeah, it's not the end of renewables. It's not the end of wind and solar. But it definitely is this vertiginous growth that we've seen in the last few years is not going to continue because a lot of that was subsidy harvesting rather than productive investment.
Got it. So a lot of our solar comes from the solar panels that come from China with the tariffs on China. Do you see some of that or more of that production moving onshore to the U.S.?
The manufacturing of panels, I don't think that's ever coming to the United States. Look, American workers are expensive. We cost money in a way that workers, and it's not just in China, if Chinese workers are getting more expensive too, but there's other places, Vietnam produces solar panels. There's other places that have cheaper labor than the United States and crucially have weaker environmental standards. Because that's another thing that isn't really talked about in the production of solar panels is that the minerals that go into it, it's pretty dirty to process that. The construction process is not very clean, and our environmental regulations that's another thing that makes it very expensive to produce solar panels in the United States.
Well, that's why I was wondering, do you think with this administration's emphasis on bringing manufacturing onshore, which between the tariffs and the tax incentives, definitely there's a very clear message: bring manufacturing back on shore. And we have the minerals. It's not like we don't have the minerals, like you say. It's environmentally challenging to harvest those minerals and then refine those minerals. Really more of arguably a bigger harm to the environment than fossil fuels is as a harm to the environment. So there's definitely that thing. Do you think that will change, or do you think that this administration is so pro fossil fuels that it's not going to change any of those regulations for the solar and batteries in particular, I'm thinking?
Well, I wouldn't expect this administration to change any regulations specifically to benefit solar, but there are changes that they are already trying to make because the critical minerals aspect is larger than just solar. These are things that go into permanent magnets.
Right.
It's a national defense issue. Jets need these critical minerals. So there's actually a very strong push from the administration to mine more of these minerals here. Now, unfortunately, from my free market perspective, unfortunately, they're taking the approach of having the government buy shares in some of these mining companies, which I don't love, but they do. There is a very distinct goal to produce those things here in the United States, and so to the extent that that is successful, that could help the solar panel manufacturing. But the problem is just because the Chinese government and all levels of government, their provincial governments too, heavily subsidize every step of the solar panel production chain. It's a government imperative. Even with the tariffs we've got now, solar panels from China are still cheaper than get in the United States. So, absent a pure embargo and not allowing Chinese solar panels in, I'm not sure how the U.S. production ever becomes competitive as far as the actual manufacture of
Got it.
solar.
Got it. Now let's kind of drill down into a typical business, and you've got this building, which if you're in Arizona, you definitely should be putting solar on it. I'm just going to say that flat out,
Yeah.
just because between the tax credits and the bonus depreciation that we have now, I mean, the government's paying for 2/3 of the cost of those solar panels and batteries. Why would you not? Why wouldn't you do that? I mean, it makes no sense. The return on investment, actually, I've run those numbers as an accountant, and they're pretty significant return on investment when you look at that. But let's look at things like transportation. So, do you see a continuing move in the free market towards electric cars, or do you think it's kind of stalled right now, in part because the tax credits are rapidly disappearing, but in part because the early adopters have all adopted, and it's not taken on. We don't have the 1,000-mile battery that Tesla promised us. What do you think is going to happen there as far as the adoption of electric vehicles? Are we really going to be all electric, or are we going to be just muddling along like we have for the last few years?
Right. Well, and keep in mind that the plateau in electric vehicle take up started last year. So it's not even this predated Trump even,
Right.
forget the reconciliation legislation. So there definitely was the growth that they were expecting, the EV boosters were expecting, has not happened. Now hybrids have continued to increase sales in contrast, which for me personally, I think hybrids are kind of the best of both worlds. You get the range of internal combustion, but then you have the fuel savings from a battery. So hybrids continue to grow in popularity, and frankly, to me, that seems like the long term, absent government intervention. I think hybrids are probably where things go.
Okay.
In addition to the tax credits that were removed in the reconciliation bill, the Trump administration has also been very aggressively moving to roll back several of the regulatory mandates that the Biden administration installed that were intended to basically force people to into electric vehicles. Now, they didn't have the power to literally mandate electric vehicles.
Right.
What they do have the power to do is make internal combustion engines much more expensive and to force car makers to produce more electric vehicles. And so the idea was that you make the competing product more expensive, and you've got a bunch of EVs lying around. Lots of people will buy them. That wasn't really working, as we saw from the slowdown in sales the last year, and now those regulations are being rolled back pretty aggressively. So again, there are so many limitations to electric vehicles that they work for some people in some places. So I don't think they're going away, but I'm not seeing 2/3, 3/4 of the market being electric vehicles.
Interesting. So unlike China, which is heavily adopting electric cars, you're not seeing that U.S. Even if we get that 1,000-mile battery, you don't see that kind of adoption. I mean, they have no moving parts. So, I own one.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, it is our car of choice. It's easier to drive. It uses very little energy. Our solar panels actually feed it. So there's all sorts of positives to it. The big downside is, of course, you can't go that far. So,
Right.
but once that's solved, you don't see that being a turning point.
No, the problem with the range issue is that there are physical limitations to how much energy you can hold in a battery. Like you can't. It's not like you can't shrink batteries and get the same amount of energy from it. The way we've improved cell phones, for instance, is shrinking the electronic components so that they can use less energy.
Right.
Not that the batteries have gotten smaller. So long term, in order to have a longer range battery, you need to take up more of the car, and you need more weight to provide that power. And that's just an inherent limitation for any long distance use of electric vehicles. But this is why in China, AVs make plenty of sense because they have very dense cities. They're not traveling very far. They also have concerns about pollution, which we don't in this country. We have catalytic converters. We've kind of solved the pollution problem from vehicles. And then they also have a huge concern that we don't in the oil
Right.
because they have to import their crude oil. And as we were just discussing, we don't have to. We are a net exporter. So there isn't a national security imperative driving electric vehicle uptake the way there is in China. So there's a lot of government pressure in China pushing forward. And like I said, they heavily subsidize the battery supply chain. There's aggressive subsidization there. So it's for them, it's a national security imperative in a way that it isn't for the United States. And here's the thing, you're one of the people, you're the type of person that electric vehicle works perfectly for. You know, like when I used to live very close to Washington, D.C., and my commute was only, about 10 miles a day, and that was most of what I drove. Yeah, an electric vehicle would be perfectly fine for that. But for someone who doesn't have a garage, someone has to use their vehicle for work and travel long distances, it just doesn't work for everybody. And that's why personally, I think hybrids really make more sense.
And you don't see technology making changes there.
There will continue to be technological improvements, but the thing is that internal combustion vehicles are improving technologically too. Mm-hmm. Their fuel efficiency continues to increase. So the cost of ownership for internal combustion engine vehicles actually continues to fall too. So it's something of an arms race. But again, I think the inherent limitations of relying on a large battery pack are always it's just going to be a limit for certain uses. Again, in an urban setting, where again, charging is a problem in an urban setting if you live in an apartment building, for instance. But again, I just don't think there's too many inherent limitations for people to talk about 100% of the market being electric vehicles. Again, maybe 50%, maybe. I mean, I think that's theoretically possible, but I'm not so sure that you're going much beyond that.
All right, that's interesting. So you're not seeing a need for business owners, for example, to put in charging stations at their office building to really accommodate the electric vehicle use, like because we have gas stations all over, so that's not a need from a gas station
right. Well, that's another limitation when you talk about electric vehicles is where do you charge? And if your employees are all using internal combustion vehicles, like as a business owner, that's not something you need to worry about.
Right.
So if you do have electric vehicles, that's just another cost, another issue and there's also the question of who pays for that charging. The installing chargers can be pretty expensive, and then the ongoing electricity supply, that becomes an additional cost, unless you're going to, I guess, try and make your employees or customers pay for it. But that obviously is just going to annoy them. So again, the question of who pays for the charging actually is another one of those inherent limitations of electric vehicles, that because you're not always going to be able to charge in a garage that you own. Like you're going to have to charge when you're out on the road. You're going to have to charge when you're going to work, and someone has to pay to install those chargers. And if you have 100 employees that all have electric vehicles, I mean, you're not going to install 100 chargers. That's cost prohibitive. But then if you've only got 10 chargers, how do you allocate the use of those chargers? Like
allocating parking spaces.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's the special parking spaces. So, and again, that's why I say there's a lot of limitations to really widespread EV adoption, because all of those questions are not problems that anybody faces when it comes to an internal combustion heavy population.
So like I understand in India, the buses are electric, and instead of charging, what they do is they go in and they drop in a new battery and then they charge the batteries separately. It seems to me like public transportation, that might be a good use for the electric vehicle.
Yes. Oh yeah. Yeah. And public transportation is actually a perfect example, because you've got fixed routes. You can plan for how long you need a charge for. Obviously there'll be traffic sometimes, but you can budget for that. It's predictable. And that's actually a place where electric vehicles any kind of electric vehicle is useful, is in predictable situations. So, if you say you're at operating a port, electrifying the vehicles driving around on the port location, that makes sense too. So there's applications where it makes sense. But it also, the problem with the battery switching, that requires infrastructure for battery switching. So, yes, maybe a public entity is willing to set that up and pay for it. But again, you think about why India is doing that, because they have pollution problems in their city. in the United States, we don't have those pollution problems. So there isn't that kind of pressure for a fix that electric vehicles might provide.
Interesting. So I want to shift just a little bit and going back to incentives, but this time incentives for fossil fuels. Now we've had very large incentives for small drilling programs in the U.S. for since the 70s, actually, and in particular the intangible drilling cost write-off, the availability for a doctor or a lawyer to get these big write-offs if they invest in a drilling program where they couldn't do that if they invest in real estate. How much impact do you think those tax incentives in fossil fuels have on the production of fossil fuel?
So I don't know that they have a huge effect on the actual production numbers. What they do affect is the makeup of the industry. Those kind of things, especially both IDCs and percentage depletion, smaller independent producers
Right.
get more value out of those
Right.
than the big oil companies. The big oil companies can't take as much of those deductions as smaller oil companies. So to that extent, those incentives certainly help maintain an independent aspect to the industry. In the absence of those, everybody would probably consolidate into 5 or 6 giant companies.
Well, and yet what you see in these small independents is that they're doing secondary and tertiary recovery, things that the big guys don't want to do. They're not interested in. It's not worth it to them. And I mean, a lot of these fields, they'll sell off the lease, right? They'll sell it off to a smaller producer, and the smaller producer's happy to go in and get what they can get because they've got these big tax incentives. Do you see that as a significant benefit to making sure that we're, fully producing our oil fields?
Well, yeah, that's an important thing to remember for people who don't know much about the oil production process. There's primary, secondary, and tertiary. The primary, when you just drill a hole in the ground and spindle top sprays up, that gets you a very small percentage of the oil that's in the ground. You have, pumping gas or pumping water in to push more oil out. That secondary and tertiary recovery, that gets you more production. So that does help maximize our domestic production. And this is the thing to think about. This is a global industry, and the Exxons and Chevrons of the world, they can go drill off the coast of Guyana, they can go drill off the Brazil and produce there. They don't have to produce in the United States. So there is an aspect to having the US independent industry. And maybe providing some of those incentives that they get that the big oil companies don't necessarily get. So there's some benefit to that. And frankly, there's an innovation aspect to it. Things like fracking, hydraulic fracturing was developed by, Mitchell Energy, an independent oil producer. So that the innovation, the biggest innovation, honestly, especially in producing in the United States, is coming from the small producers and the independent guys. So, you can argue that there's some value to that. Me personally, free market person, I don't think there should be a corporate tax really at all. So I'm not going to argue about which deductions are better than others. I'll get rid of all of them. But yes, I think that certainly is the argument that you'd hear from the independent producers, that support for independent producers encourages production here, encourages employment here, because the smaller producers have more employees domestically than the Exxons and Chevrons do. So that's certainly a defense that is presented for those tax provisions.
So I have one last question for you, and that's nuclear. So France has doubled down on nuclear power. They've doubled down on the small nuclear power plants. In the U.S., over the last 20 years, we've gone heavy into the small natural gas production, right, where we've got plants for a single factory, right, where you have a natural gas facility to power a single factory. What do you see happening in the U.S.? Do you think that the regulations will ever get over this? I think of it as country head trash that we have about nuclear, and will we actually start doing it and making use out of it, where it's clearly the cleanest and the most efficient of the energy types?
Yeah, I mean, nuclear is great, and yeah, like you said, if you care about emissions, you should be wanting to build nuclear everywhere because that can provide can fuel a modern economy with zero emissions. The problem is as you said, the regulatory environment for nuclear in the United States is just absolutely god awful. And short of burning down the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and rebuilding a new regulatory system, I'm not sure how you fix that.
Mm.
Any things like small modular reactors, which is the
Right.
great coming in the future, even that you're just talking 5 or 10 years. We still don't have that. We've built some of those in like national labs, but we haven't actually put them into economic, like actually beneficial economic use yet. And the regulatory environment, it continues to be bad for that. And unfortunately, I think the future of nuclear is going to be some innovation that happens outside the United States. It's going to be South Korea or France or China developing new technologies that make things easier, faster, cheaper. And then maybe we'll end up importing some of that to the United States to use. But unfortunately, the domestic industry is just so suppressed. And you also have the fierce competition of cheap natural gas. Like the reason
Right.
we all these natural gas plants is because natural gas is almost too cheap to meter in parts of the United States. So the nuclear has that double whammy of a horrible regulatory environment and a really cheap competitor that it just makes it hard. And look, the thing is that if we had spent the last 20 years building a nationwide fleet of nuclear plants, and instead taking the money that we use to subsidize wind and solar
Right.
and build nuclear plants, we'd have the best of both worlds right now.
Yep.
And frankly, we may have gotten over some of those cost hurdles that we could actually build nuclear plants cheaply again. Because we used to be able to do that.
Right.
First built them in the 60s and 70s, we could build them fast and cheap. Um, but I just unfortunately I don't see. I know that Secretary Chris Wright, the current energy secretary, is really enthusiastic about trying to fix the regulatory environment for nuclear. He really genuinely wants to. I'm not sure how much he can do on his own. And the problem is that the next Democratic president that comes into office, you're likely to have anti-nuclear environmentalists making a lot of decisions again. So it's hard to make, a nuclear power plant is a 5-10 year investment just to build it. And with political ping pong, it makes it kind of impossible to do.
Really hard.
It's unfortunate, but that's just kind of the reality we face in the United States.
Interesting. So, wrapping up, what would be 2 or 3 recommendations you would give to business owners when it comes to energy and what they can look for in the future and how to kind of help their employees navigate through things like even such things like commuting, utility costs, brownouts, things like that?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest thing with energy is it's to keep in mind when you're running the numbers is to run the numbers, with whatever subsidies and mandates are pushing things, but also run them without that. Because a lot of these investments make perfect sense. Putting solar panels on your roof in Arizona makes perfect sense regardless of subsidization. Like there's that added value. The problem is when you're making decisions to try and chase subsidies, that is putting yourself at risk because ultimately subsidies are politically driven. They're not market driven. So they can be taken away at any time, which is what's happening with the reconciliation bill. And the other point too is just for electricity production in general. There is a danger in certain parts of this country that we are getting close to the capacity limits of what our electricity capacity is. And that's very much a concern and something that especially if you're an energy intensive business, that's something you have to think about. You have to think about backup capacity on site, diesel generators, if that's what it comes to. So that's an investment decision that hasn't really been a thing in the United States for a long time. But AI is going to continue to increase demand for electricity.
I was going to say we have massive data centers going in now for AI.
And to the extent that people are transitioning to electric vehicles, that's adding demand. So there is demand growth in the electricity system for the first time in close to 30 years. And the investments in power generation have not been there the last at least 20 years. So it's a bit of a catch-up mode right now, but nuclear takes time to get into process. Natural gas takes time as well. There's backlogs in urban production. Even wind and solar have issues with land use and permitting. So it's something when you're thinking about large investment decisions as a business person, like electricity now is something you do have to think about, because where you locate where you locate a factory or a facility is going to be affected by electricity availability at this point. And that's something that you haven't really had to think about in a long time.
Well, honestly, even if you just have 100 workers working on computers, you cannot afford to have those computers down.
Right. Exactly.
You can't get brownouts, and of course that also then you have risk to the drives of the computers, right? Because you're actually risking having jolts of electricity in there. So there's all sorts of bad things when you don't have a really strong grid. And of course, there is a lot of discussion about our grid's really old. And so there's a lot of issues there too. So thank you, Kenny Stein, for joining us. Where could we find more about what you're doing and what your organization is doing when it comes to energy?
Our website's easy to remember, instituteforenergyresearch.org.
Awesome. Thank you, Kenny. Thanks, everyone, for listening and watching today. Energy drives our economy. Energy is critical to every single person's needs, almost every single moment of every single day. And so let's keep it in mind. And I think, Kenny, your advice: don't ever let the incentive tail wag the investment dog. We'll leave you with that. We'll see you next time on the Wealth Ability Show. Thanks for listening to the Wealth Ability Show. If today's episode gave you a new perspective, remember this: the tax law is not your enemy. It's a roadmap. And when you know how to follow it, you can build real, lasting wealth. If you're a business owner or investor who's tired of overpaying taxes, the Wealth Ability Accelerator is your next step. You'll have the opportunity to work directly with me for 80% less than my standard rate. And I'll personally guide you through how to change your facts so that you can change your tax. Go to wealthability.com/bonus and apply today. Remember, it's not just what you make, it's what you keep.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.